Hi everyone, my name is Ian. I'm in the neuroscience program at BU. I'm also working in Swati Kiran's lab studying speech language and hearing sciences. And so my talk today really is a story. It's a story about stress, a story about language, and a story about aphasia. And hopefully I'll get into what all those terms mean today. So I'll start from the story of my own, basically. A couple of years ago, I was in a translation seminar. At the time, it was taught by Professor Margaret Litvin, whom some of you may know as the professor of global Shakespeare's in KHC. So I went to the seminar each week, and there was a senior there named William. William was studying linguistics at the time, and he was doing his thesis work on medieval Latin. And so as the semester went on, I got to know William better. And we both learned that we both took Latin at various points in our careers. Him during college, me during high school. And so one day, we had a speaker come in and talk to us about a Latin text. And afterwards, William pulled me aside and said, "Ian, you speak Latin, right? Read this for me." While I can't remember what exactly it was he showed me, it might have looked something like this. Does anyone know what this might sound like? Sure, go for it.
Something like Arma virumque cano troie qui primus laboris Italiam fato profugus la win yaque veni clitora.
Great. So, let's give me an hand here. Great. So, yes, that's what it sounds like. So I read this, or something like this, and I remember his comment pretty vividly. It was, "Oh, you don't stress stuff at all. You can't read this at all." And so you can't read this at all. And so that caught me by surprise. So we talked about it for a while, and I explained to him, like, well, I learned Latin in French school. And so what I realized was I probably had a French accent reading Latin, believe it or not, that's possible. And so in French, stress is handled much differently than in English. So this story taught me one thing, that language affects how you stress words when we're talking. I would end up revisiting this question years later when I started working in a lab, and when I did, I decided to flip it. I wanted to know whether stress can affect how we say language too, not just the other way around. The reason why I asked this question was I started working with patients with aphasia. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What is aphasia? Now, I could talk to you all day about what it is and what it involves, but it's probably easier if I just show you.
Okay. So what's your name?
Scott. Oh, no. Sarah Scott.
That's right. And how old are you?
I can't.
Try.
I can't.
So, as you might imagine, this is pretty debilitating. It's really hard to communicate with this disorder. And so a bit of background on what aphasia is, it's often caused by brain injury, usually stroke, but it can also be like traumatic brain injury or degenerative diseases. The core symptom is difficulty with finding words, and it affects all aspects of language. This includes production, understanding, reading, writing, anything with language. So it's pretty devastating to have this condition. So people have shown that people with aphasia, which I'll abbreviate as PWA, often struggle more with verbs than with nouns. So for a word like record, one being something you listen to music to versus record, something you might do with a tape recorder, hopefully somebody knows what that actually is, because I don't. People have more problems producing the verb form of this word. People have also shown that for two-syllable words, people with aphasia struggle more when words have stress in the second syllable. I'll call this weak strong for the rest of this talk. And strong weak meaning when stress is on the first syllable. So again, record is strong weak, record is weak strong. So my question was, could verbs be harder to say in aphasia because of their stress pattern? Why does this matter at all? Why even ask this question? Well, in English, most two-syllable nouns tend to have strong weak stress, whereas most two-syllable verbs tend to have weak strong stress. So maybe there's a pattern here, or maybe that could be part of the reason why verbs are harder to say in aphasia. So my hypotheses were that people with aphasia would have more problems producing verbs than nouns. They would also have more problems producing weak-strong patterns and strong weak-stress patterns. And finally, when these two interacted, so in weak-strong verbs, they would have the most trouble because you're getting hit both by verbs and by weak-strong stress patterns. So what did I do? I recruited 11 people with aphasia and 12 controls and had them repeat words, lots of them, 80 words total. And these two-syllable words were balanced for both nouns and verbs, and strong, weak, and weak, strong stress patterns. So you can see here a strong noun would be patience, a weak, strong noun would be belief, a strong weak verb would be listen, and a weak, strong verb would be amuse. And so then I coded and analyzed the errors people were making as they repeated these words. So when I say errors, what do I mean? I mean errors either in phonology, the sounds people were producing, or in stress, the way they were stressing the words they were saying. So people may have, say, added a sound. Instead of saying event, they would have said revent. Or they may have taken out a sound. Instead of saying arise, they may have just said rise. They could have switched the sound, they could have substituted a sound. So instead of saying patience, they would have said patience. For stress errors, they might have placed stress in both syllables. So instead of saying induce, they would say induce, which sounds a bit off to me at least, maybe to you as well. And instead of saying improve, they may say improve. So they switch the stress pattern on it. They regularize it, what the default is in English. And so the results were people with aphasia were about equally likely to make errors on verbs versus nouns. That was a little surprising. They were more likely to make errors on weak, strong words versus strong, weak words. This is pretty consistent with what the literature has shown so far. And finally, when looking at weak, strong verbs, they weren't any worse at that than saying weak, strong nouns. So what does this all mean? I guess is a good question to ask. To go back to the hypotheses, I originally thought that people with aphasia would have more problems with verbs. That wasn't true in this task. I thought that they would also have more problems with weak, strong stress patterns than strong, weak stress patterns. That was true for this particular task. And finally, I thought that they'd have the most trouble with weak, strong verbs than any other category, because you have both verbs and weak, strong stress combined. And it turns out, no, not really. So again, what could be going on here? So why? I guess that's a really fundamental question. Why? Why all this stuff? Why all these findings? Why were they equally likely in nouns and verbs even with weak, strong stress? Why was there no difference? One possibility is that when you're just repeating a word, whether it's a noun or verb really doesn't matter as much to you. What you can pay more attention to is like the sounds you're hearing and the stress you're hearing, and just say that back to the person you're talking to. Whether it's a noun or verb may be less relevant or less salient to it. Alternatively, what could be happening is that when you're repeating a word, the stress is more powerful than the class of what the word you're saying. It's like the fact that it's weak, strong has more relevance than the fact that it's a verb versus a noun. That's also possible. But whatever the explanation is for these findings, what it told me was that stress does matter when you're finding words, at least in aphasia. I can't really say as much for normal speech, but in aphasia, yes, it does matter. So future directions. Something I would like to do in the future is look at longer words. This pattern really applies only to two-syllable words. So it'd be interesting to see whether this plays out in longer words, like three-syllable, four-syllable, five-syllable words, etc. Possibly even in discourse, not just like saying a single word at a time, like in sentences too. I also might want to revisit words like record and record, words that are ambiguous with their stress pattern and what class they are. The reason why I couldn't use these words on this particular task was because in English, there really is no such thing as a weak, strong noun or strong weak verb with like record and record. It's always one or the other. You're missing two categories of that. You can't use them for this kind of task that I was looking at. And finally, the biggest limitation on this study was that it was only in English. So I don't know whether this pattern holds for other languages, like say French, like Abby was talking about, or Spanish or Italian. So it would be interesting to look at whether this pattern appears in other languages, and if so, how? What pattern is there, if anything at all? So there are a lot of people who contributed to this work. It's not just my project, it's a lot of people's projects. My PI, Swathi, my postdoc, Carrie Niziolek, and my professor, Ann Carney, have been really helpful in shaping this project. In fact, I'm defending this in front of them tomorrow morning, so wish me luck on that. I would also like to thank the Aphasia Research Lab members, especially Natalie Gilmore, Jeff Johnson, and Rachel Riskin. Two others as well, Shreya Chaturvedi and Christine Wu, helped with the project like design and implementation. I'd also like to thank professors, friends, family, and mentors who are in this room right now, some who are not, for being supportive of me in the process of getting here. It's been a lot of fun with all of you. I really do appreciate it. I'd also like to thank the participants for giving their time, energy, and commitment to this work. This really would not have been possible without them. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. I realize it's early on a Sunday morning, and it's a lot for science to be told at this time of day, but you know, you're all here, so I really appreciate it. So, with that said, Are there any questions? Yes.
Do you think that this can help us understand, or maybe I can flip the question on its head, how the brain treats the construction of verbs and nouns? In other words, how I'm thinking more in terms of the structure of language. What is a noun? What is a verb? In terms of what brain areas, or how different brain areas may treat these different constructions, in the sense that if stress is having an impact, for example, or if stress is being impacted, there must be some reason for that.
Right. So I didn't get too much into this, but there are models like how language works, like how we retrieve words. And so I think with nouns and verbs, that's less relevant there in the models, but I think it does have a bearing on how we're assembling sounds and stress in language. If I had to guess what's happening with these patients, the problem isn't as much like finding the right sounds, but integrating the sounds and stress together when they're retrieving the words. So with weak, strong stress, since it's not the default in English, what could be happening is there's a problem integrating the two of them. And so because of that integration problem, they can produce errors in sounds, more so than in stress. Because if there were just a problem with the stress pattern, you might expect them to generate a default. It's like do strong, weak, but that really isn't what happened here. They weren't regularizing the stress like to nouns and verbs, they were just making sound errors on them when they're weak, strong. As for nouns and verbs, there has been a lot of literature showing that nouns and verbs may be processed differently in different areas of the brain, which might be why, for say, a Broca's aphasic, they have more problems with the verbs, because the lesion tends to be more frontal, whereas the Wernicke's or anomic aphasic, more fluent profiles, tend to have lesions in the more temporal areas of the brain where nouns may be processed. Does that answer your question? Great. Connor.
What was the breakdown, speaking of different types of aphasia, between Broca's, Wernicke's, global aphasia, connection aphasia?
That is a good question. So there were 6 Broca's, or 6 non-fluent profiles, 4 anomics, and 1 Wernicke's. So the Wernicke's individual, he actually, I couldn't include his data because he did really poorly on this task. And actually, I realized he was Wernicke's after the fact. So for some context for the audience, people with Broca's aphasia tend to have more problems with producing language. For the most part, they can understand it pretty well. But the problem is getting the words out in the first place. Whereas people with Wernicke's aphasia, they have problems understanding language, but their production is fine. So if you talk to one of them, they may say something to you, and it may sound fluent, it may sound intelligible, but it really doesn't make sense at all, because they don't get what they're saying, and they don't get what you're telling them. So the Wernicke's individual, he really couldn't do this task at all, because it involved listening to words and then repeating them afterwards. So he's pretty impaired on that. Tyler.
So it seems like you went into this research question with some literature knowledge of that verbs were difficult, or more difficult than nouns. Is there any reasoning why? I don't think you've touched it.
I did not, that's right. So there are a couple of reasons why that might be. One is that nouns and verbs may be stored in different areas of the brain, which I was mentioning earlier. Another is that they're processed in different networks. And a third is that maybe verbs are more syntactically complex. And it turns out people disproved that one, at least in one study, where they're looking at Chinese aphasia, where morphemes are not really present or tenses aren't really present either, and they still found the same pattern. So because this happens in languages where there isn't really more morphological or syntactic complexity, they're guessing that's probably not why that might be. Yes, you.
I think the video that you showed us, it related only to stroke.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other case of, can you tell us more about any other cases of aphasia where it can occur without having a stroke?
Absolutely. So one case is traumatic brain injury, like say someone has a gunshot wound, or say they're pretty hard, like an accident. That can happen there. There is also a condition called primary progressive aphasia, which is a neurodegenerative disorder, like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. And in that case, you have a breakdown of the cells in the brain, and that leads to aphasia in the end. So yes, it is possible. The most common is strokes, because strokes are honestly the most common cause of it, but there are also other causes of it too. Yes?
Do you know, now I know you said you didn't know so much about what regular people do, but do you know if regular people have a preference for words that are stressed in certain ways? So do English speakers like, words that, let's say, have the stress on the first syllable versus the last syllable? Is there a general trend?
I can say that in English, the majority of words tend to have first syllable stress. They tend to be strong, weak. So in that sense, yes. But only because most of the words to begin with are strong, weak. It's less so a preference that's what language looks like, and that's what they use in everyday speech. All right. Thank you so much.